Hi there everyone, my name is Bel Russell and I am presenting to you on the topic of the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the Australian criminal justice system. Indigenous people make up only approximately 3% of the Australian population, yet they comprise a factor of 16 times that, or 48%, of the population within the juvenile justice system. In this presentation, I will examine this vast overrepresentation and discuss some of the many factors believed to have contributed to its development. Fundamentally, I aim to convey that the current disparity in representation rates of Indigenous youth is a direct result of Australia's history of colonisation and the pervading legacy of Indigenous disadvantage. So here's an overview of my presentation. I'll first look at colonisation and the stolen generations. I'll then look at the notions of transgenerational trauma and intergenerational criminality. I'll then look at the distrust and disillusionment that Indigenous people feel with the justice system before I look at what is currently being done and what more needs to be done. I'll then provide a summation of my presentation and I'll invite your questions and feedback. So my initial focus of this presentation is to consider what are some of the prevailing reasons for the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the criminal justice system. To quote the 2001 parliamentary report on this topic entitled Doing Time, Time for Doing, contact with the criminal justice system represents a symptom of the broader social and economic disadvantage faced by many Indigenous people in Australia. I understand this quote to mean that representation rates result from criminal activity, and this criminal activity results from the abject disadvantage and disparity of welfare that Indigenous Australians suffer as compared to non-Indigenous Australians. Australia's Indigenous population are consistently reported as having comparative deficits in education, employment, life expectancy, and mental and physical health statistics. They are also overrepresented in homelessness and poverty rates. As Canine 2008 attested, it is the lack of ability and opportunity brought on by widespread disadvantage that is leading Indigenous Australians to criminal activity. And really, it is no great challenge to comprehend how an individual with no job, no education, possible mental or physical health issues, and nowhere to live might indeed come into contact with the justice system. So why is there this persistent disadvantage in Indigenous health and welfare statistics as compared to non-Indigenous Australians? Academics believe that the roots of this problem can be traced back to the barbaric treatment of Indigenous people during Australia's colonisation. During this time, Indigenous Australians were violently massacred, tortured, mentally and physically abused, and utterly dehumanised. They were also dispossessed of their lands, which were not only culturally sacred to them, but their only means of survival. As a further result of colonisation, Indigenous people were introduced to a variety of diseases and addictive substances, such as alcohol and tobacco, to which they were extremely susceptible. Understandably, these actions instilled a sense of anger and injustice into the Indigenous people that still very much exists today. As Gracie 2014 states, the traditional way of life and fundamental fabric of Aboriginal society was irreparably devastated by colonisation. In just a few short years, the barbaric acts of the foreign colonisers forced the members of the oldest culture on earth into an irrevocable position of pervasive disadvantage, dependence, and discrimination. As well as colonisation and the extensive trauma associated with that time, the later governmental policy of forced removal of Indigenous children continues to play a significant role in the enduring disadvantage experienced by the Indigenous population. The children that were stolen from their families were subjected to a process of forced assimilation, wherein they were forbidden from using their own language, names, and traditional style of dress. In this way, the Aboriginal culture and identity were erased, and people were left not knowing or understanding who they were. The actions of the Australian government during the stolen generations resulted in the formation of deep-seated feelings of anger, resentment, and distrust that are still very present within contemporary Indigenous society. A further outcome of the stolen generations is that the children who were taken are left with no knowledge or experience of traditional parenting. So not only are they unable to pass on their culture and sense of identity, but they are also incapable of exhibiting positive social bonds and behaviours for their own children. In this way, there are multiple generations who suffer, rather than only the individuals who are themselves stolen. This transferal of suffering is referred to as transgenerational trauma, and is an acute reason for the prolongation of Indigenous disadvantage. As observed in Bringing Them Home, the government's 1997 report on this topic, the impact of past suffering has created a cycle of disadvantage that continues to resound through generations of Indigenous families. Closely related to the notion of transgenerational trauma, and a further contributing factor to the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth, is the notion of intergenerational criminality. Intergenerational criminality, as I'm sure you can infer, denotes the transmission of offending behaviour within multiple generations of the same family. A British study undertaken by Farrington, Coyd and Murray in 2009 found that in 411 offenders, there was significant intergenerational transmission of criminal tendencies. They revealed that from this sample group, 63% of the offenders reported having a father with previous criminal convictions. Closer to home, these results were reflected in a Tasmanian study that found that an individual with no parents with recorded criminal convictions had only a 20 to 24% chance of coming into contact with the criminal justice system. But an individual with at least one parent with a criminal conviction had a 75% chance of contact. Considering Indigenous adults are also overrepresented in the criminal justice system and are almost twice as likely as non-Indigenous adults to report a history of contact with the juvenile justice system, it is easy to perceive the cyclical nature of this issue. In order to make real progress in the aim of reducing Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, it is imperative that the cycle of intergenerational criminality is broken and that each generation has improved welfare and greater opportunities. The final contributing factor to the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth that I wish to examine concerns the Indigenous population's general distrust and disillusionment with the criminal justice system as a whole. It has been suggested that an effective starting point to understanding how some Indigenous people view the criminal justice system is to appreciate the system's historical role in enforcing colonial authority. Indigenous people have long viewed the police and the government as their enemy rather than their protector. And indeed, these were the establishments responsible for murdering their ancestors, stealing their children, and being involved in the multitude of Indigenous deaths in custody. Cases such as those of Mr. Ward, who died in 2008 when the metal prison van in which he was being transported reached temperatures hot enough for him to sustain third-degree burns, and Ms. Jew, who died from septicemia whilst being held in custody at a police watch house in 2014, further strengthen Indigenous people's distrust and anger toward the authority of the justice system. The oftentimes lack of severe punishment for the officers involved in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' deaths in custody also serves to enhance these views. Feelings of contempt for the justice system and anger at police and government authority, if translated into action, can result in higher arrest rates for Indigenous Australians, which in turn contributes to their vast overrepresentation. So what is being done? There are a number of programs in place in an attempt to combat the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the criminal justice system. The majority of these programs involve diversionary measures so as to preclude contact with the system itself. In this endeavour, there exist numerous community-run Indigenous youth programs throughout Australia. The Yiraman Project, operating in the town of Fitzroy Crossing in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, is one such program. It involves Indigenous youth being taken out to country and taught about their culture and history, as well as developing traditional skills, including hunting, camping, tracking, and cooking. The idea behind the Yiraman Project is to allow the Indigenous youths to connect with their land and culture, and to develop relationships with elders and other young people, thereby steering them away from risky behaviours and instilling a sense of pride in their cultural identity. As well as community-run initiatives, government-funded programs also exist as part of the Australian Government's Indigenous Advancement Strategy. One of the more successful of these programs is the Aboriginal Night Patrol, which operates in many cities throughout Australia. The aim of these patrols is to get involved at a street level with Indigenous people, both youths and adults who are at risk of coming into contact with the justice system. The Perth faction of this initiative is the Nyungar Patrol Outreach Service, which operates both day and night patrols in a number of Perth metropolitan areas, including Northbridge, Midland, Burswood and Fremantle. Senior Supervisor of the Nyungar Patrol, Tanya Rowe, describes her role as looking out for her mob. She states that for them to step in before the police does keeps people out of the justice system, and that Indigenous individuals are far more likely to listen to them as fellow countrymen rather than the police. As well as these kind of programs and initiatives, youth justice conferencing is also used as a diversionary measure for young people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from entering the criminal justice system. Justice conferencing relies on the notion of restorative justice, wherein the victim of the crime takes on a more active role, allowing the wrongdoer to theoretically garner a greater appreciation of the consequences of their actions. It usually involves a sit-down mediation-style setting, wherein the offender is encouraged to accept responsibility and negotiate a form of restitution. The Australian Government's Youth Justice Report 2017 has actually revealed that across the board there has been a decrease in the number of youth involved in the criminal justice system. However, whilst there has been this overall decrease, it has been proportionately far greater in the rates of non-Indigenous youth, which has actually resulted in an increase in the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth. One step forward, two steps back. So what more needs to be done? Whilst the programs and initiatives I've just mentioned are positive, they are, as Julie Tongs, CEO of Winunga Aboriginal Health Service phrases it, Band-Aid solutions. Weatherburn, Fitzgerald and Hewer, 2003, provide further support for this claim by stating that diversionary tactics have limited potential to reduce Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, and that the best way to achieve any progress in this regard is to tackle the underlying causes of Indigenous involvement in crime. This, I believe, is key. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned a quote from the 2001 Parliamentary Report on Overrepresentation, Doing Time, Time for Doing, which was, "Contact with the criminal justice system represents a symptom of the broader social and economic disadvantage faced by many Indigenous people in Australia." So in keeping with that analogy, it is the cause that needs to be treated here and not the symptom. Because if we never treat the cause, we'll never get rid of the symptoms. So what we need to focus on is the widespread physical, social and economic disadvantage suffered by Indigenous Australians, not merely their overrepresentation within the justice system. Co-creators of Change the Record Coalition, the key organisation in the quest to lower Indigenous representation rates, Shane Duffy and Antoinette Braybrook, believe that the solution to achieving change lies in the formation and implementation of a cohesive national strategy. They outline the characteristics of their proposed plan of action in their organisation's Blueprint for Change, noting that this strategy must involve a bottom-up approach and be formulated in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is vital, as without it, the strategy will resemble colonial action by the government and will likely be resented by Indigenous Australians and ultimately unsuccessful in any of its objectives. Change the Record further believes that national justice targets concerning Indigenous representation rates need to be incorporated into the existing governmental targets, and that an Indigenous-led independent agency should be established to coordinate policy and data collection in this regard. The Blueprint for Change further advocates for the provision of services, not sentences, so as to help individuals rather than just punishing them, and it also continues to maintain that imprisonment must always be the option of last resort. The truth must be accepted that embarking on the road to effect real change in the area of Indigenous disadvantage is going to be long, controversial and difficult. However, it is also true that there remains no other option, and without action in this regard, the symptoms of disadvantage, such as justice system representation rates, will only get worse. In this presentation, I have explored the notion that the causes of the vast disparity in representation rates of Indigenous youth stem from the abject disadvantage suffered by the Indigenous population, both historically and presently. Fundamentally, I have conveyed the imperative need to involve the Indigenous community in any action that is to be taken, and the overarching requirement, in the interest of treating the cause rather than the symptom, to rectify the widespread disadvantage suffered by Australia's Indigenous population. Thank you all very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to your feedback, questions and comments on discussion board. Thank you.